This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign, 90.1, your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. It is Sunday, November the 18th, and this is 2018, and this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and everything that Dave has been up to for the last week.
Well, been a busy week. We have three major topics here. One is that we've been approached to sell some of our Heartland Pathways prairie preservation site, and some other sites are in consideration too. The second event was an Urbana bicycle get-together, mainly the last chance for people to work with regional planning to look at bikeways and walking ways in Urbana. The third event was a successful fundraiser at Sleepy Creek Vineyards in Vermilion County. And all three are very interesting, exciting, and possibilities for the future. The first item is of considerable concern. We have in this area not too many long rail trails. The Kickapoo was the first long distance trail that connects different towns. There are shorter trails in places like Bloomington and Springfield and other places, including Champaign-Urbana, but short. So most of the cities have bikeways without the necessary connections to towns and cities across the country. Part of the reason why we have so little is that the soils are very rich for agriculture, so every inch is taken up for farming or other uses. We have a very successful 2-mile, rather narrow trail between Monticello and 2 miles to the west across the Sangamon River. It's a safe trail. It's an interesting trail across the bottomlands. It doesn't violate the adjacent territory very much. You have ambience from a bridge, and it works to join the old town Monticello with the suburbs to the west. It ends at a new Piatt County library. And there is also in there a site of 30 acres for a possible ballpark. The site in contention is between that library and another 4 miles to Cisco. One of the major concerns for Heartland Pathways is that this area does not have a lot of remnant prairie. The remnant prairies are along active or abandoned railroad beds and in small cemeteries. So we have 3 small cemeteries plus railroad beds. And for the locals who don't know where the cemeteries are and they wouldn't be encouraged to have a lot of tourism to them, The rail beds are vital at the local level. So we have 4 miles of reasonably interesting remnant prairie. It's not the best because we don't have the best. We have what's left. There was no set aside for prairie. There was tons of writing about it, especially by women who were losing the last of the prairie to farming. Those records are in the University of Illinois archives and elsewhere. Poetry, artwork, and just a respect for prairie. In this case, we have a narrow railroad bed, probably 100 feet wide, and most of the roads ran parallel to the railroad with a space between. So there's right away for the road and right away for the prairie. That corridor is also occupied by infrastructure for fiber optics and for power lines. So this is not the greatest, but it's the only. The trusts that look at this, looking at it for possibly a trail, that is rather controversial, because over the 30 years that Heartland Pathways has owned the bed, it has been working in the sense of conservation is a responsible land acquisition and use, land use, legal land use, and it can be construed by locals who haven't really encountered a prairie for 6 generations as a possible site that should be either used for agriculture or developed for a trail. The trail emphasis comes from successes across the country. The bike and hike groups have, over the last couple of decades, grown in strength. You see bicycle ways around the various cities. You see some concentration on signage and use of the corridors. So independently, they've been interested. They also started to buy railroad beds for bike and hike purposes. The Congress observed this, was a little worried that they were losing too many railroad lines, and observed that bikeways could preserve those beds. And so the bicycle people and the hike people too, and the biological preservation people have been very helpful in working with the federal government, the Surface Transportation Board, to preserve railroad right-of-ways. There's now about 30,000 miles of them throughout the country, but very few in east central Illinois, basically because of the glacial wealth of the soil. So the proposal that comes from the trust proposes a trail through the prairie. It's rather controversial because over 30 years the prairie has started to invade the ballast where the train used to run, and we're pleased about that because it also gives us a slight variation in the habitat. it's slightly drier on the ballast, so you're going to get species that like drier places, microorganisms that fall in the same category. They can handle some gravel. So if you take a trail, say a 4-foot trail, a narrow trail, along that corridor, you're going to take out reconstruction prairie. We can have the reconstruction prairies elsewhere, but they're a poor facsimile of what a remnant prairie is and the interaction of the ecosystem. So my thought is that if we do look at a trail, then we have to look at it in the context of a total complex. So let's go back to the 3 cemeteries in the context. The region needs to keep some of its prairies. There's a conflict between recreation and preservation. Prairie preservation doesn't look very aesthetic. It's depends on who you are and what your interest is, but prairie can often be looked upon as weeds and taking up utilizing land space that could be used for agriculture. And the bicycle people have developed an interest. Kickapoo Trail, for instance, is the first phase of it is very successful. And so there's a tendency for communities that are near to rail trail situations to think that they can utilize that ballast as a trail. That's okay, but if you look at the Kickapoo Trail, the treatment is like one size fits all, and it's taken out all the prairie on either side. We would like to avoid that. If you are going to do that, you're going to have a trust that is willing to put its own money into trail development, because from the Surface Transportation Board down, you're going to have a wide trail that'll take out all the prairie that we have saved. The alternative is to have a walking trail and confine it to 4 feet. Perhaps cap the ballast with limestone to waylay EPA constraints that associated with leftover creosote. We would try to not have the batters. The batters are those areas on either side of the ballast where there's an embankment, they go down. Where there's a cutting, they go up. So if they are also treated, then we lose a lot of our original prairie. So how do you work with the overall concept? We need the prairie. We need the bicycle ways. We need to think not only of preservation, but we need to think about the attractiveness of bicycle ways. So my suggestion is here that if you're going to proselytize the community for funds to make this possible, then you need to put forth an overall plan for how this fits into a complex that runs from Champaign to Clinton to Armenia, to Cisco, and on into Decatur. It involves, in the center there at Armenia, Allerton Park, which was put together by Sam Allerton in Civil War days when he was providing food for the armies to live on and work on. And then his son, who eventually gave the Allerton Park to the University of Illinois. So you're working with the University of Illinois because some of the site that we were dealing with is a possible walking trail to Armenia, which is the farm management center for the farm part of Allerton Park, which keeps the house part of Allerton Park in action. Not easy. It doesn't create that much funding to keep the house going. But in recent years, there's been quite a move to improve the house situation. There's been a move to have a visitor center there that is big enough to handle decent-sized events. They put in solar panels there, and all around there's been an interest. Chapin Rose, a member, has been there, along with a lot of interest parties. So we know that Allerton is 25 miles from town, but town is Champaign and Urbana, and Champaign especially is talking about a huge visitor center with ice hockey teams and convention center that would be big enough to handle a few thousand people. Those people just don't disappear from town quickly. It's axiomatic that we may have people who are ourselves, but also people who are visitors who want to see the ecosystem that is ours. Another group, the Monticello Railroad Museum, is nearby, and over a couple of decades it has become a very attractive tourist place with historic railroad equipment and events, and it's become a feature for the Monticello area. The offshoots from the Monticello Railroad Museum have put together a Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad. For a historic railroad with an attempt to get historic trains into Champaign. It's a dream, and it's difficult to do. It involves 4 miles of Heartland Pathways territory that is being re-railed. Then the preservation of 3 miles of, probably more like 7 miles of railroad bed that is intact at the moment, but could be abandoned and demolished between Seymour and Staley Road. At Staley Road, the railroad continues to be active in servicing plastic factory and gravel materials company and Kraft Humco, and so there's a reason for keeping the line from there. But to get that into Champaign requires talent. Associated with that is an interurban line that is could be returned to a trail between Whiteheath and Seymour. Between Seymour and Champaign, it's kind of been consumed, is the word. These are not easy projects. But if you're looking at taking on one of our only remnant prairies, then you have to think about the overall nature of the project you're suggesting. In the case of the 4 miles between Whiteheath and Seymour, the prairie will remain on either side of the bed. The bed was put in a linear fashion and taken out in a linear fashion, and so the soils and microorganisms and on either side are still there, and despite some herbicide drift from the power companies and other situations where there are drainage problems and the like. But it's there. So we want to keep these places, and we want to keep them in context. If you look at the rail bed that we have intact, it runs also from Whiteheath to Clinton. That's 23 miles. It goes down past a interesting picnic ground, in horsehair picnic ground on the banks of the Sangamon, goes across the Sangamon Bridge that people have been willing to put finance into preserving. And that railroad bed continues across a tributary of Madden Creek and up to Lodge. At Lodge, there's a north-south Norfolk Southern Railroad, which recently Norfolk Southern was thinking of taking out 1,500 miles of railroad. They've been concentrating on main lines rather than on what used to be short lines for grain collection and been taken over by supermarket elevators that have their own railroad connections. So we're looking at Whiteheath to Shady Rest, to the Sangamon River, to Madden Creek, up to Lodge. There was some thought that as Norfolk Southern closed out railroad beds, they might close out the north-south line, which would make it possible to take a rail train down to Shady Rest, across the river and up to Lodge, and then down the main line, presumably retired, to Monticello and back to the Monticello Railroad Museum. That's not something that's likely to happen quickly. It's not something that's likely to happen without a fair bit of cost. To put in rails, even just down to Shady Rest, so we could run a Chautauqua, is a cost. And there's maintenance over the years. Railroad ties don't stay around forever. They have to be strong enough to handle possibly a steam engine, and there's a maintenance. So just acquiring the land is not enough to justify the possibility of re-railing. We're finding that problem coming around from Whiteheath. You have to find a rail line that can be the same size as what is the Railroad Museum, and you have to find ties. So overall now you're looking at a complex of Allerton Park, the rail trail alongside it, the bottomlands of Monticello, Lodge Park, which is a wonderful park, Shady Rest, Whiteheath, and in there's 7 miles of active railroad owned by the Railroad Museum. And they also have areas where they used to only be able to run on an interurban line to the top of the Cerro Gordo Moraine Hill. That line is now being used often to store ADM tank cars, and there's demurrage on that gives Monticello Railroad Museum the opportunity to do interesting things, and they bought more land to make it possible to not be foreshadowed by development in there. there is a little railroad interurban line that runs from Monticello through to the Railroad Museum. It's near a cemetery that has loaded with interesting history for the region. The Railroad Museum doesn't necessarily want a lot of people moving through their yards, so that might require a negotiated trail that would go around the museum. Not deny the visit to the museum, but the visit would be somewhat controlled, so there was no funny business with trails going through. Then there's 7 miles up the hill, and you could go perhaps on that 7 miles if it wasn't occupied by rail. And there's a thought to put an electric train there. And that is a possibility. If you go to other railroad museums in the country, in Iowa, for instance, they run regular trains, they run narrow gauge trains, and they run electrical trains. So once again, this is looking to the future. In our lifetime, it will not probably happen, but it's there. And where those trains used to park at the top of the hill, there is an open space which is kind of loaded with prairie. Across the road is a simulated George Washington house that didn't get completed. The person that was doing it died in part, so when it was not complete. But the area is kind of interesting. If you go to the next junction, if you go from there on a section road over the I-72, you come to a junction, and you can go south to Lodge Park, which is a wonderful park that has an interesting driveway through it, and you don't have to get out and destroy the native vegetation. It's sitting right up against your windshield, and so to the south there's that, and you could take people back to Monticello via the Railroad Museum or via the cemetery and the State Street, where there are these huge big buildings that were the result of a peppermint factory that invented basically Pepto-Bismol as a laxative, and it was promoted worldwide. So there's history there. So going back to that complex, we need to look to prairie preservation, but in order to get prairie preservation without it being invaded by bicycles, then you have to look to see how bicycles can move around too, and how people walk, and they also jog, and they like to jog on these places. So how can we work with a total complex? There's also the potential that is written into the Railroad Banking Act that suggests that if the elevators, like the elevator at Monticello or at Cisco, might want to take grain to Monticello, then it would have to come over the railroad. So there is a covenant on that easement across the river that is for rail. So rails, trails, and greenways was the intent of Heartland Pathways wanting to buy the bed, but it was buying it more than just for one or two sites. It was buying it for a total complex. If you go to the section that goes from the west or the north end of the Railroad Museum across to Clinton, it's not likely to return to rail. We only bought the pieces between the villages. The villages have an elevator complex, and they have a facility they need to work. So we bought pieces between. Sometimes it's been invaded, some because people don't always understand what we're doing to try and preserve the native vegetation on either side of the ballast. On the other hand, there are many farmers who, one, believe it is our right to do what we want to do with our purchase, and two, know very well that if they're going to have new crops in the future or new biochemicals to meet a disease we don't know about, they're going to have to go to these sorts of places. So they understand, and it's sympathetic. But go right through to from Lodge to DeLand to Weldon to Lane, and then you go down across the Salt Fork River. This is about a mile south of the face of the dam which creates Clinton Lake. And then that railroad bed goes up. The railroad is going across at low level. Going down a creek saved them excavation. So they would go down to the creek, and then if they have enough power, they go up the other side, and there happens to be a Hensley moraine there. It's kind of interesting and rolling. And the Weldon Springs State Park has a springs there that is artesian, and it owns land on both sides of the railroad bed, and then you go into very close to Clinton, and that could be arranged to go further in there. So looking at that complex very carefully, we would like any trust to at least pay homage to the overall. It is not going to be easy to do something in the Clinton area. They've been having huge arguments about putting PVCs into the landfill, and that has brought together 80,000 people who drink from the underground aquifer there. So there's been a lot of legal debate, and in that framework it's not easy to do other things. Oh, so back to the 4 miles between the library at Monticello on the west side of the river to Cisco. The trust we're dealing with is suggesting a walking trail. If you're considering bicycleways, there is an old highway, the old Route 47, which was the highway before I-72, which runs parallel a little to the west and takes all the traffic. So you've got a reasonably old highway with space enough to have a shared road. So as you decide to have a walking trail, how do you keep it a walking trail in 20 years' time if it looks like it's a good bicycle trail? Well, you work with the bicycle people, and you work with the community. The community is not unaware of their nature. Lodge Park is full of wonderful native vegetation with some artificial vegetation, pine forests and the like, but it's wonderful. Shady Rest is now in the hands of the Piatt County Forest Preserve and has trails through it, but it's also has a soil and water conservation easement on it. So it's protected for the future. How could we dare to run down there for Chautauqua with a railroad bed? Can we get enough money to do that? Can we talk to the possible fundraisers to alert people to the overall dimensions that we're talking about, at least report on them, at least have a plan that goes beyond just one of the ice cream sites that we would like to preserve for prairie. That means looking at the future. That means looking at maintenance. That means looking at how wide your trail is. We would like a narrow trail. Some institutions, when people want to put a trail through a natural area, are creating it one way and just 18 inches wide, so that it doesn't damage the nature, but it allows people to get awareness. So one of the comments here is that the trail will allow awareness of prairie in that area. That's true if there is maintenance, if there is signage. A decent sign can cost you $200 and more. A kiosk at Armenia, where there's a maintenance, a farm maintenance place, then you could put there a kiosk, which is a sort of little shelter that explains what the devil's going on. At that site, we have unfortunately had our elevator, which we thought was an icon of the region, burned down. But the concrete elevators are still there, and there's a little history there too. Okay, we are looking at that and back and forth to see what we can do in the future and do it realistically.
You've got 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, so the next thing is in terms of balancing recreation and preservation. You're in a situation where there's not much compromise because there's nothing else, no other prairie left. So the grand old statement of let's compromise should have happened many years ago. This is a situation where there's not much room for compromise left. So the next event that I went to on Thursday night was the regional planning office has been contracted by Urbana City to put together a bicycle-way plan, and it's very comprehensive. It would remind us that to have a plan for the prairie in Monticello requires a plan, and a plan can involve quite a lot of details. There's first of all, where would you want to walk? Where would you want to hike? Robert's proposal for a trail that would go to the campus that would join Kickapoo to Urbana and then possibly on to campus. There's along the boneyard. It has been sort of closed down for a while. The idea has been closed down because there are so many things of interest that are going on at the same time, and so Urbana has chosen to work mainly with the introduction of the Kickapoo Trail, which is fair enough. They put in, they have constructed prairies on Main Street. Main Street is kind of dangerous, so some of us are suggesting a trail that goes straight through, instead of going on to Main Street, if you're coming from Danville or coming from St. Joe to the Main Street entrance, it's kind of curly and it's narrow and it's dangerous. The Forest Preserve, which owns the Kickapoo Trail in Champaign County, is willing to, owns a portion of that roadbed to Dobbins Drive. There's a piece of Norfolk Southern Railroad that extends over Smith Drive, and that is still intact in a manner with trees growing in, and it might be possible to buy that piece and to work with some sort of easement that would go around the north part of the railroad yards that are still used, and the line is active out of Urbana to Champaign to Mahomet and Mansfield, where it connects with that north-south line that I was talking about, and takes out grain from Anderson's. So it's still there, and halfway along the yards is an MTD occupying what used to be the roundhouse for steam engines and engines in their day. We're looking for a trail that goes across, probably over University Avenue, instead of you having to fight traffic further in town. We're looking for a trail that you can get to Champaign connecting using back roads. So if you go over University Avenue, you can drop into Ambax Park. If the next step is to go through the sanitary treatment plant and through a piece of the Banner Park district, which is on the banks of the Boneyard, and you go through to a centre that they have there, and onto Kerr Avenue. From Kerr Avenue, you go to Broadway, and from Broadway you go up past or through Busey Woods. There are some people who wouldn't want you going through Busey Woods, but there is a power line easement there that means that there are no trees there. Trees can short. In fact, they're being accused of shorting and starting fires in the west. So you get to the other side of Busey Woods, and then you go south on Kohler, and to a set of lights that go across Lincoln Avenue, which is another busy territory, and then you find your way across Washington to Washington in Champaign, and under the Canadian National Railroad, and onto an old retired Wabash line to an open space between State and Randolph. So you have to think about how these things integrate, and how you might be able to have a train come into that same site as a historic train, where you could have a centre. Okay, some of these thoughts are floating around in the presentation. We're asked as how we learned about this, and most people answered that it was by word of mouth or by email. They had various ways of you commenting on your ideas. Could you put a dot on the pothole that you don't like, or the intersection you don't like, or can you write a statement about it? So there were some comments here. Do you have any comments about proposed bikeway design? Do you have any comments about destination indicated by these signs? What are your four top corridors? Are there other issues? And they have listed all the streets, so you could go to the street and check up your street and leave your address. And there's a handout by Dennis Roberts about the Boneyard piece. Quite costly, but very productive. Probably a lot of people there, and willing to put their dot in the right place. The next event that I went to was on Friday night, was a fundraiser for the Kickapoo Trail, and it's not unrelated. Here we're dealing with the recreators and the preservators, and the preservators have a hard time. The recreators like this trail. It's very well used, and so I'm looking at a folder here, which the fundraiser was a $50 a head. And so I would suspect there were at least 60 people there.
Wow.
And that means a serious contribution. 6.7 miles is already open. There's 5.4 miles in design, and there's 8.5 miles in Vermilion County, going through Scythian and Muncie, and then there's this huge bridge which is 100 feet high and a quarter mile long, which will belong to the Department of Natural Resources. At the moment, it only goes to the fairgrounds, which is owned by the Kickapoo State Park. That's the nomenclature for the rail trail. I talked to Statsky, who has been the county engineers, and they're very interested in trying to get that an extra 4 miles into Urbana. That's often a problem. It's a problem for us with historic trains coming into Champaign. Once you get to the city, it's a little more difficult to get a free trail into the area. At the moment, there's a railroad bed that you can back up a train a mile long and park it. It can be parked up actually over the expressway that goes underneath it. And I noticed that this expressway has Kickapoo Trail signs on it. It's advertising. At the moment, it's owned by the active railroad, and it's not likely to go into a trail. But there's always a potential in the future. We're putting together skeletons that make it possible. And here the suggestions are fairly large. Small donations will get recognition on the website. $1,000 will get a larger recognition. $5,000 a plaque, $10,000 a bench, $25,000 and trail node naming, and $50,000 a signage marker, and $125,000 you get to name a bridge. And so people are aiming high, and it's coming in, and they're from the federal government, the state government, and the local government. We're looking for the same sort of thing in the Monticello area. It has, in the long run, we would like to have connectivity between Decatur, Champaign-Urbana, Whiteheath, Monticello, Cisco, and into Decatur. I talked to all sorts of people. We donated a bunch of pictures, prairie pictures that got sold. There was the opportunity to talk. Jason Linkett, who is in charge of our Urbana public television opportunities and the camera that's operating at the present time, was there with his brother. They were part of a band that played for the night, and it was just wonderful to meet a lot of people. Okay, I've got a few minutes. I'd like to tell you about the walking trail. The walking trail is proposed. It would come, for those who know it, and if you don't know it, go to your website or go to your map site and look for Allerton Park, because Allerton Park is very much a part of this. The intent would be to have a walking trail, would go from the library at Monticello along the railroad line, a walking trail, not a bicycle trail. Bicycle trail would be parallel. And then you come to Armenia and farm management area there. There's a road that would allow you to come onto the south end of County Farm Road. And then you go into the entrance of Allerton Park. You could, if the farm section was willing, have a trail on the side. The road is fairly narrow and probably wouldn't handle a shared road. So there are alternatives here. So you go into the park, and there's a reconstruction prairie there. And you could find a way into the reconstruction prairie and back onto the road that goes around the house. You can take a side trip to the house, but go across the bottomlands, across the bridge, and then turn left when you come to that avenue of Norway spruce that is kind of popsicleized. But there is in there used to be an aerial for the television people, and it's still there and could be a visitor center perhaps. But take a walk along the recently purchased heron rookery to a trail that's a levee trail that's about 100 acres, and it connects with an old landfill at Monticello and into Monticello itself. And then if you want to connect up with the railroad, you go through Monticello on trails that have been designed by the Farnsworth Group, the engineers that are involved in this sort of thing. And it takes an old interurban up to I'm trying to think of the name. There's a park very near to the cemetery, and into the railroad museum area, and we've talked about that before, getting a trail around it. So there's connectivity. But if you took that trail another mile further, you'd come to Willow Branch, and you can take Willow Branch down. There's a nice little remnant prairie there, and you can stand on the bridge and you could look at the Willow Branch meandering. So you have all this hydrology, and then it ducks over and gets it into the Sangamon River. And then you could go down, and there's a road that would allow you to access into the Sunsinger. But you go back to the Willow Branch Road, you go over a very new concrete bridge, and to the right is an embankment that's absolutely loaded with understory herbs in the spring. And you go around the corner, and there's a little plot of prairie that gets burned every so often, and there's pumps, wells from which water is taken for Decatur. So there's a little lesson to be learned there. You go past the Calyx Center that provides camping and functions for music and dancing, and then you come to the road that goes through by the Preby House and comes into the Monticello. You could go through. You don't have to go onto the road. You go through and parallel the river, go onto the embankments from which you can watch the heron rookery, and then you come to a little parking lot on the Norway spruce area, and across the road is that vacant lot that used to be where the WILL antenna was. And so I think we're getting to a couple more minutes. So we're thinking that the walking trail might be extended to the Willow Branch Bridge. We have, that corridor has 3 creeks that run through. So there are 3 trestle bridges. And in the whole process that we're talking about, we've managed to save 3 truss bridges, 27 trestles. Sometimes the ties have been stolen, so they have to replace the ties. If you have enough money, you can prefabricate a unit that you can put down with a crane in sections on the bridge and make it viable. I think it's quite okay if walking people have to walk across it. You have to have a surface. They don't necessarily have to have railings, but railings might be a safety factor. So we're dreaming, and I trust people are more concerned with doing something now in our lifetime and not being too expansive in our dreaming. But the dreams are there, and we need a skeleton. We need to leave a skeleton for future generations, and that's what we're doing. And so it's a back and forth at the moment to see if this is possible or impossible. It is nice to have a range of people on your trust that have legal responsibilities, that have biological responsibilities, and financial responsibilities. Deanna Glosser is the CEO, and she has been associated with the Department of Natural Resources and Endangered Species. So there's a range of talent there on the board that may be very helpful in making this a possibility. So we're talking one-to-one to start with, and then one to others. We don't want to see this one segment taken out and left alone away from the possibilities of trails. And we do want to know how you can walk on these places and how you can envisage connectivity. So these three items relate to each other: the Kickapoo fundraising, banner, bicycle way event, and the discussions of the possible purchase. So this is, I think this is enough. David, you may have a comment since you're a bicyclist, and I've left you out of this.
About the only comment I can make is we're coming on the season when I'm less likely to ever get on that trail. I actually rode it the very first day that it was open when they dedicated it. That was a long day of 20 plus miles of bicycling to get to the trail, ride the trail both directions, and get back home again. But yeah, it's
That's
great.
The Kickapoo Trail.
The Kickapoo Trail, that's right, yes. I've been trying to picture your description of where you come through town. I've got my own. I really enjoy some of the streets in Urbana for a very nice way to get all the way across town. I suppose that's probably not feasible to use one of the actual streets as the official bike path. Have an official set aside from the street for the bikeway to get across from the main street where the trail currently ends all the way across Urbana. That's kind of a meandering way of saying, yeah, getting out and bicycling is an important thing to me. But yes, the official ways that people do it, sometimes I work with them, but sometimes I just find my own way to get around. You mentioned they were asking what people's 4 favorite bikeways are. I'm sure that lots of people listening who get out and bicycle have their own favorite streets to bicycle on. I've always told people that John Street and Clark Street are 2 really excellent streets to use in Champaign to get east and west. And it's actually now noon, so we should probably let people go. And
this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. Thanks for listening, and keep paying attention to these trails.
And Dave on the board. The views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.